Well, the City of Coventry prided themselves traditionally on public communication and participation, and through all their reviews of development involved the public as far as they could in various ways. However, you're asking me to comment on ethnic minorities. It's true to say that they were not apparently positively identified as an issue for consideration in our various development plans until perhaps the period from 1975. And the situation arose there that the council wished to review the whole of the Foleshill district of Coventry, which is concentrated on the area that we know as the railway triangle, the city centre northwards, railway on the left-hand side to Nuneaton, and the avoiding loop line on the right-hand side, facing north, and areas just surrounding there. And there had been various plans for that area ever since the war, in that the first development plan review after the war looked at the need for comprehensive redevelopment, for example, in Hill Fields, which is South Foleshill and Spon End. And then when we came to the next review of the development plan in 1966, we identified a whole series of potential comprehensive development areas which were intended primarily for redevelopment, but in that Foleshill area. When there was the review of the 1973 structure plan, it was decided that a lot of those areas intended for complete redevelopment should preferably be only partly redeveloped to a smaller scale, and that there should be improvement carried out to some of the existing properties linked to the areas of redevelopment. And of course it is well known that improvement, particularly of housing stock, is an ongoing problem where there remains insufficient investment. So this tended to be a rundown area needing investment and needing redevelopment and rehabilitation simultaneously. There had been defined within the area, therefore, action areas which could be an amalgam of these two options, and that structure plan defined those various areas, and there was put in operation a whole series of action area plans. And for example, Eden Street was one particular one, and that is just one action area within the Foleshill complex. And it was determined that with so many close action areas in that neighbourhood, it would be desirable to have a district policy guide encompassing the whole area. And so we thereupon set upon the Foleshill District Policy Guide, which is a significant review of the whole of that area. And it is in that guide that we see for the first time, as in the list of key issues to be studied, ones which include facilities for specific groups, including immigrants. Immigrants with English language difficulties, the economic importance of the area, community relations in Foleshill, And thereafter, the Falls Hill Policy Guide really became the first corporate review that covered the interests of the ethnic minorities. Now, the ethnic minorities really arrived in Coventry for various reasons. One being changes in the Indian subcontinent, boundary changes between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, unsettled people who then decided to emigrate. Later, there was Africanization policies, particularly in Kenya and Uganda, which meant an influx of primarily British citizens, but who were originally of Asian extraction. There were, because of the high employment prospects in Coventry, earlier than that, attractions to immigrants seeking work primarily from the West Indies, and also refugees in the early post-war years as a result of the war, particularly Eastern European, Ukrainians, Poles included. And more recently, there have been refugees from, for example, Vietnam and Chile. Now, the numbers of these various minority groups vary. And from the latest census in 1981, it's interesting to look at the balance. People with heads of household from the new Commonwealth and Pakistan, by 1981 totaled some 30,000, of which 4,000 were Caribbean extraction, 18,000 Indian, 3,000 Pakistani, 600 Bangladesh, 2,500 East Africa, but basically Asian extraction, and other 1,500 plus. And it was estimated in that census that by 1986 there would be a further growth within the city of those groups of an additional 4,000, which would give a current ethnic minority population of approximately 34,000 out of a city population of, say, 312,000, which is something like 11% of the population. But of course, those are not evenly distributed. They come into a city looking for opportunity, initially with little in the way of financial resources, so they look for cheap housing. They look, as time goes on, for their own cultural background as neighbours. And so we therefore find that certain particular wards in the city have a very high ethnic minority population compared with others. More particularly, the Falls Hill area is the concentration, and particular wards, St Michael's, City Centre, North Hillfields and so on, Falls Hill ward, and others peripheral to that have the higher concentrations. And particularly in some of the schools, there are therefore very high concentrations with a majority of those school places. So the considerations are quite widespread and different in different areas, and the trend has always been that after that first settlement, and as people find perhaps an economic base, they then tend to move out. And so now we find in every ward at least a low percentage. Now, when we started out on the Falls Hill Policy Guide, we undertook public participation in the usual way by having a significant number of public meetings in the area, by having news sheets articles in the press, exhibitions, and in this case, because of that, took particular trouble to give opportunities in the various minority languages in order that there could be better communication. And as a result of that, it was very interesting to look at the public participation response. And as in all these exercises, there's a booklet which identifies the process, and that is done on the basis of listing all the responses, identifying their source, grouping the issues, and then reporting to committees potential responses to the issues that have been raised. And it's very interesting that in the Foles Hill area, from clearly a multicultural population, there is a mixture of issues which might be some specialist to those groups and others issues of a community in general. And they vary from things like level of open space provision, manpower for leisure facilities, the problems of the Coventry Canal, reducing the level of industrial activity where there is a problem with local industry, the allocation of additional land for industry, the Broad Street Jetty area, industrial development in areas allocated for primarily residential uses, small firms, economic policy, the quality of the environment, blighted properties, shopping, Asian places of worship, and so on. And during that process, which took mainly from initially 1975 to the report in 1979 to 81, nationally we were becoming more aware of issues because of the Race Relations Act 1976 and the need to promote racial harmony on the one hand and at the same time reduce discrimination. And the concern was that this was linked with locally the economic depression, which meant there were coming into the city significant numbers of people trying to get a footing, trying to get jobs, many of them finding them initially in some of primarily public services, railway services, bus services, hospital services, and so on. And then, with economic decline, unemployment rates rising, and many of the ethnic minorities being at a disadvantage in the labour market generally. Therefore, it was important that the City Council take on board very positive communication and very positive concern with the issues being raised. And in parallel with that, the City Council took another initiative which was to analyse really as a public relations exercise Coventry, a multicultural city, 1980, the religious, linguistic and cultural backgrounds of the principal minority groups in the city. And it's very interesting to analyse the concentration, for example, of the religious buildings, the mosques, the temples, the other centres. Because we're dealing here with many cultural backgrounds, Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Afro-Caribbean interests, as well as Polish-Ukrainian, excluding other churches that were there previously. And the need for communication into their communities is very important. And the conclusions in the draft policies of the Foleshill District Policy Guide are very interesting. The City Council effectively at that stage, and for the first time, 1980, looked at the implications for ethnic minorities of all its policies across the board, adopted an equal opportunities policies relating to all citizens, which meant that for some disadvantaged citizens there had to be some special services to help them. And the policies included, for example, the need to know the extent of the ethnic minorities and their ethnic minorities in order to identify the services they needed from the City Council and elsewhere. The implications on things like school curricula, mother tongue languages in schools, the role of further education as the lead-in from school to employment, the role of community colleges as distinct from the old traditional comprehensive school, so that in a locality the school is a focal social point which deals with not only children but services for all ages in that locality. The need to balance specialist teaching, the very important communication need to increase the representation of ethnic minority groups on the boards of governors of schools. And that is important not only in schools which have a high ethnic minority amongst their pupils, but also in suburban schools, in order that they shall have an understanding of what a multicultural society is. The need for additional resources to encourage voluntary initiatives to give supplementary education for particular minority groups, consideration of a programme of monitoring educational progress of all pupils, encourage other organisations and companies, other employers in the city, to introduce equal employment policies. An instruction to all City Council departments to review their establishments in the light of the Local Government Act, the Race Relations Act, and give further consideration to the employment of ethnic minority staff, bearing in mind that 11% of the total population of which they comprise. To give consideration to the keeping of ethnic records in order to provide sufficient information to provide for services. To look at its housing allocation policy. To continue staff training to ensure that the cultural background of ethnic minorities is properly understood by all those that link to City Council services. To organise regular courses for the staff. To continue to recognise that ethnic minority staff can make a particular contribution to the quality of service provision, especially where there are concentrations of ethnic minority clients. And to take further account of the fact that ethnic minority groups sometimes have special needs, and to consider sensitive adjustments to those services. And those can apply, for example, not only to education, but to social services, housing, health, and so on. And so, there's been direct City Council policy of increased communication. And they link very closely to the Community Relations Council, of which I'm chairman, to improve that communication. And recently, special government grants are being taken advantage of, called Section 11 grants, which take advantage of some government funding in support of employment in ethnic minority services, and that is very helpful indeed. And the Planning Committee only recently, as one particular committee, have set up a forum which will directly involve ethnic minorities in considerations in the Forest Hill area in particular, in issues such as their views relating to shopping or places of worship, social centres, and so on. So there is indeed, from 1980 particularly, a very close and positive policy consideration by the City Council, by the Community Relations Council, to ensure involvement of ethnic minority groups. They are 11% of our citizens and therefore need integrated consideration.
Well, the next question, I suppose, is what's your view of where Coventry's going now?
I wonder, before you do that, if I could say as a former city councillor that I was asked by various Asians to try to use my influence to give accommodation to their children after school for continuing their education, or rather allowing them to continue to understand or to know all their customs of their people, and they did not want to lose it, and also they wanted them to learn the language, their own language, so much so that in a lot of cases as a school governor I was being asked to try to make it their language, first language, not English. And that was the great difficulty, and I did get on quite well in so far. I had these deputations coming to my house, all sorts of people, making their case, and I got quite a long way with the education department to do this. But by doing it, the education department finally came to me and said that by giving them this opportunity, if you were not careful, there were so many differences in the types of religion that one had to try to provide it in various ways. Otherwise, you were going to cause trouble between the groups. You probably realise it, Terry.
I think the main thing is an appreciation by the host community and all the ethnic minority groups.
Yes.
The city is a total community. We aim that it shall be a multicultural society, and therefore all those groups, including the major host society, need to be aware of the issues involved. There needs to be a good understanding, because if that doesn't happen, misunderstanding can breed distrust, ultimately frustration, vandalism, trouble. The main thing is good communication and reasonable understanding of other groups' situations.
I think that's why they've chosen very wisely in asking you to look after this, because you appear to be very understanding.
It is obviously a problem that central government had sort of trying to deal with, I suppose, because when I gather there was even a riot in Handsworth, a small one, the night before last. I heard of some. I didn't hear about it myself, but
There might have been.
yeah, I don't know. It's obviously important that there needs to be some emphasis placed on that kind of thing. And obviously, I would assume things
But
like
one
that
must also understand that one can have problems in cities of hooliganism and vandalism that are common to all sections of the community.
That's right.
And one needs to be very careful before one determines where one thinks the causes lay. Because the causes may be basic social causes. Deprivation in an area of facilities, whether it's housing, education, unemployment. And those frustrations can lead, as we see, to small groups and become gangs that are just as much a white community problem in some areas as they are from coloured people.
Yes, it wasn't so.
And in fact, some disturbances, often late on Fridays and Saturday evenings, tend to be very much mixed groups. Not necessarily in confrontation.
And I suppose that's something actually to a certain extent that local council officials, which about in one local council in general have very little control over anyway. That's what I've seen. I mean, you can't sort of, I suppose you can't really sort of prescribe solutions to the problems. Which
No, one has to analyse in great care what each incident, is. You see, it's very interesting. Back in 1973, we had a whole series of ward meetings to do with the annual review of city policy. Happens every year, but can choose different topics. And this was a have your say in ward meetings. And there were 50 public meetings held in wards throughout the city. 1,600 members of the public attended. Issues of concern had been decided beforehand for them to respond to, but they could raise other issues. And they included car parking, Coombe Abbey leisure, housing, street cleansing, vandalism, and under fives. Now, vandalism, hooliganism, tends to be an issue for consideration every so often. It is staying with us. It seems to be some reflection of our present society, of our present, frustrations perhaps for young people particularly. There's very close liaison between the City Council, Voluntary Service Council, the Community Relations Council, the police, the magistrates, the probation service, to endeavour to analyse whether there are any common strands, where action might be taken. And that clearly is a current concern, which I think will go on.
I think sort of certain festivals, things like the Hillfields happening, obviously, and sort of opportunities for sort of Afro-Caribbean sort of festivals to read for poetry and that sort of, I sort of went along to some of the events in the Hillfields Festival, and I found that very interesting because so often I myself don't come into contact with the sort of culture of any Afro-Caribbean culture at all. I mean, I've only ever been to the Afro-Caribbean Club in Swan Street once, and that was quite interesting. I mean, I didn't even know what lie behind those doors there.
That's right.
And it was quite interesting. So I suppose those kind of festivals are quite important as well.
They are, particularly in the sense where they go public. And of course now there are an increasing number of social centres that link to minorities. You've mentioned the West Indian Club in Swan Street. There's an Indian community centre just being set up in Edgewick, north of the city. Very recently there's a Muslim centre taken over an old church. There's great concern that multicultural youth facilities are introduced in Hillfields, and that's under active consideration at the moment. a new role has evolved also for the Belgrade Theatre, because that is the civic theatre. As you know, that has run a festival in August for the last few years, and increasingly they are inviting the ethnic minorities to join in their festival. And I think the more that one can see this, the more encouraging it is. And it is certainly very encouraging in some of the community colleges where they have mixed pupil range, to see the joint activities, many of them cultural activities, that they all join in. I mean, what were traditionally Caribbean steel bands, you will now see with white and Asian players with the West Indians. I mean, this is the good thing to see, and it will only be by people living alongside, working alongside, taking leisure alongside, that one will see the integration actually happening.
Because obviously I think prejudice is actually bound up in ignorance and it's sort of not... and that those sort of things can actually break down that level of ignorance. Because
that's right. And of course, remember now that the bulk of the school children, apart from a few refugees, Vietnam, Chile and so on, are born in this country now. And therefore they are going through our schools as normal citizens' children do. And I think time will, in fact, help a lot. Particularly in mutual understanding. But education is the key to the whole of our society, white suburbia as well. They will come and enjoy the facilities of the coloured doctor or the coloured nurse or the coloured driver and so on, or the shop assistants. But perhaps their children might be in an almost wholly white school. But it's very important that those up-and-coming citizens are taught the basics of true multicultural living. And therefore I'm hopeful the time will effectively bring our community closer together.